next speaker is Mr. Adrian Day. Mr. Day is a recognized authority in global and resource investing. He's a frequent speaker at conferences around the world where he provides his deep understanding of macroeconomics and political trends. His understanding of the world is underpinned by his passion for liberty and what happens when it is diminished. He has authored 2 books on the subject of global investing, in the international investment opportunities, how and where to invest overseas successfully, and investing without borders. Adrian Day has been a huge influence in my recent professional life, and he's a mentor. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Adrian Day.
Excuse me. Thank you very much, Jane, for those very kind words. I'm going to talk today on a rather unusual topic, perhaps. Let me start with a story. It's the 13th of April 1919. Brigadier General Reginald Dyer, a British Army officer, gave the order to shoot on thousands of unarmed Indian protesters massed in an enclosed garden in Amritsar in the Punjab. And when the firing finally stopped, and it stopped only because the troops ran out of bullets, 379 men, women and children lay dead. And this was the infamous, Amritsar massacre. An incident that stains the reputation of the British Empire. Now, most people, when you ask them about the British Empire, they think that it was a whole series of massacres, even genocide, where the British simply plundered whatever countries they wanted in order to build wealth at home. And of course, these days it goes without saying that the British Empire was a thoroughly racist enterprise. So today I'm going to ask an unusual question, and that is, can a libertarian support empire? Perhaps a little more prosaically, did the British Empire do more good than bad? And at the minimum, I think a more nuanced view should be considered. Now, it might be difficult in principle for libertarians, or for anyone for that matter, to defend the concept of empire, where one nation takes over another country, normally by force. And that, of course, when we're talking about empire, that's unless we're talking about colonists settling uninhabited lands, homesteading that we heard about earlier. And homesteading is certainly a significant part of the history of the British Empire. The very word colony, by the way, comes from the Latin colo, which means to cultivate. But to a libertarian audience, perhaps I can ponder the question, and Mark kind of took us there a little bit with his Martians coming down and imposing freedom. Is an imperial form of government really any worse than a government where thugs within a country assume power, such as in Haiti or Iraq or in China, or even where a majority within a country impose their will on the minority, otherwise known as a democracy? Is it really inherently any worse? Now, I'm not going to try to suggest, it would be foolish to suggest that an imperial form of government, or the British Empire for that matter, was nirvana. I'm not going to suggest that. But I am going to argue that the British Empire was not as bad as it is currently nowadays viewed, and it brought a lot of good to the world. Let me ask a question first of all. If we exclude Canada and the United States, first of all, we'll just exclude Canada and the United States. How many people in this room, either themselves or their parents, were born in a former British colony? And if we include America and Canada, which were both former British colonies, how many people in this room were not born in a former British colony. So 5 people in the room were not born in a former British colony. And so that in itself tells you something about the difficulty I have in talking about this topic in half an hour. Oh, I better get my watch out, hadn't I? In half an hour. Because the British Empire at one point covered a third of the world's landmass, and it lasted for over 400 years. So very extensive in terms of time and very extensive in terms of geography. Normally when we talk about the British Empire, of course, we're talking about from 1623 onwards, from the sailing of the Mayflower, and I'm going to focus a little more on what historians call the Second Empire, which was after 1776, after the Americans very ungratefully decided they didn't want us anymore. But even in that period, we're talking about a long period of time and a huge landmass. I think it's important at the beginning to realize that the British Empire wasn't developed deliberately. John Seeley famously said, "We seem to have conquered half the people of the world in a fit of absence of mind." It happened in many different ways. There were settlers, there were conquests, there were indeed countries that invited us in to govern. I'll come to that later. There were also territories, Palestine is one, but Britain received as a mandate from the League of Nations or the United Nations saying, "Hey Britain, can you please administer this country?" So the British Empire was accumulated, if you like, in many, many different ways over the years, and it was governed in many, many different ways. I mentioned you had settlers, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, who basically took over the entire country. You had countries where you had a handful of administrators in what we call direct rule, where you had local rulers who continued to rule, but the British kind of oversaw them and took care of defense and so on. So many different ways in which the empire was governed. So I'm going to try to, because of the time and because of the extent of this, I'm going to narrow it down and look at just a couple of issues, or 3 issues really. And I'm also going to emphasize both India and Hong Kong, which some people think is part of China. India and Hong Kong in deference to our host and hostess. And the things I'm going to look at are, number one, what were the motives of people who took part in the imperial enterprise? I'm going to argue that if outdated, they were not hostile, and they were not particularly racist, and that will come as a surprise to some people. The second thing I'm going to look at is a few of the stains on the record, such as Amritsar. And the third thing I'm going to look at, which again will come as a surprise to people, is the support that the British Empire, that the British rulers enjoyed from a large portion of the people that they governed, a large portion of the people in the British Empire. And in sum, I'll argue that the British Empire, on balance, was a force for good in the world, both in the material sense, but also in the abstract sense. I'm not going to spend a lot of time arguing that the British Empire was better than other European empires or empires that had come before, although frankly it was. I mean, it's not for nothing that Joseph Conrad, who lived in England, who lived in London, did not set the heart of darkness in a fictional British colony. But on balance, as I say, it was a force for good. So let's just quickly look at motives. A lot of people think that the only reason people got involved in the empire, the only reason that governments went and took over other countries, the only reason that people from Britain went out to other countries was to plunder. And that is simply not true. You can see in the thousands of diaries, the thousands of letters home from people who were what we'll call colonists and the administrators of the colony. An overarching theme of duty. Now, again, what I'm going to say is going to sound patronizing, condescending, certainly out of date, but I'm going to argue is benign and certainly not hostile. The novelist John Buchan, he wrote 39 Steps. Some of you will have seen the film if you haven't read the movie. He wrote that Britain is enriching the rest of the world from her customs and traditions. John Stuart Mill, who was referred to earlier, a good classical liberal, he wrote of British rule in India, and this is perhaps a little bit extreme, not only the purest in intention, but one of the most beneficent in act ever known to mankind. And Winston Churchill asked this question: what enterprise that an enlightened community may attempt is more noble than the reclamation from barbarism of large populations, to give peace to warring tribes, to administer justice where all was violence, to strike the chains of the slave, to plant the earliest seeds of commerce and learning, to increase in peoples their capacity for pleasure. What more beautiful ideal or more valuable reward can inspire human effort? Now, these comments might seem a little romantic and idealistic, and there's no question that the practice did not always live up to the ideal. But what I want to emphasize here, from again the thousands of diaries and letters that you read from people involved in the empire, is that this was largely the ideal of people. They believed that they were abroad, and their role was to help civilize other countries, and there was very much a Whig view the British, that the British would develop and cultivate people until they were ready for self-government, ready for independence, and that was Britain's mission. So again, one can argue that that's condescending, but I'm going to argue, or arrogant, but I'm going to argue that that is not hostile. Now, a lot of people know, I mean, there's many examples, a lot of people know that the British abroad could be condescending and arrogant on an individual basis. I'm going to argue in a second this was not racist, and it was not hostile. It was, in fact, the natural way of behavior for the aristocrats and the gentry that were in charge of the British Empire and formed the bulk of the British Foreign Civil Service. And I'm reminded of that wonderful scene. I don't know if anybody's seen the movie Bottle Shock. There's a wonderful scene in that movie, I recommend it, when a rather annoying character says, you don't like me because you think I'm a pompous arsehole. I'm not a pompous arsehole, I'm just English. Again, as I say, throughout the empire there was a sense of duty, and this is most clearly illustrated, I think, by Princess Elizabeth, the future Queen Elizabeth, by her pledge on her 21st birthday in 1947. She was in Cape Town, South Africa, and she said here, "I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong." Those are noble words, and I think in the case of Queen Elizabeth, she's lived up to that. But note the use of the word family. The British Empire, and later the British Commonwealth, they were seen as a unity. They were seen as a family. They were not seen as Britain and the rest, Britain conquering the world. They were seen as a unity. We were bringing people in to the British family. Now, I mean, I know this sounds sort of kind of odd or romantic or antiquated today, but it is truly the way people felt about it. I just mentioned quickly I've mentioned racism a couple of times, and I'll just there's obviously, I think it's true to say that on a collective basis, there's no question that racism was a way people viewed the world in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. But on an individual basis, it was really not racist. Queen Victoria in 1858, after Britain assumed control of India, the British government assumed control of India from the East India Company. She said, this is 1858, she made the pledge that racial discrimination would play no part in India. Now, it didn't quite work out that way, but the point again that I keep trying to come back to, this is in 1858, the Queen is saying there will not be racial discrimination in India. Rather than being a racist enterprise, the way we should look at it is as a hierarchical enterprise, and I've already referred to that. But status was much more important than race. And if black natives were not allowed into the English Officers Club, it was not because they were black, it was because they were not of appropriate class. And Britain, in its empire, particularly in India, parts of Africa and elsewhere, they took native kings, native princes, and these people were regarded by British governors as superior to the white working class who wound up in the colonies. Now, if you'll excuse me using rather inappropriate language, I'd like to tell an anecdote. And this is from 1881. King Kalakaua of Hawaii was visiting England, and he was a guest of a party given by Lady Spencer, who was a great-great-great-grandmother of Diane, Princess Diane. So he was a guest of a party given by Lady Spencer. Also attending the party was the Prince of Wales, the son of Queen Victoria and the heir to the British throne. And another guest was the German Crown Prince, the future Kaiser. Now, Prince Edward insisted that the king, the Hawaiian king, took precedence over the future Kaiser, because a king is higher than a crown prince. And of course the Kaiser objected. Now, in rather colourful language, and excuse me for this, the prince told his brother-in-law, either the brute is a king, or else he's a common or garden, and if the latter, what the hell is he doing here? Now, that seems very insensitive to us and certainly seems offensively racist. You think about it more carefully, it's actually if you like, it's actually a pre-Enlightenment view of status. But a king, wherever he's from Hawaii, from Nigeria, from wherever he is in the world, the king is of a higher status than a crown prince. And that really was the governing principle, for better or worse, of the British Empire. And this was recognized, incidentally, by Joseph Schumpeter, who wrote in his book Imperialism and Social Classes. He made that point. And so again, you've got hierarchical people like Lord Curzon, one of the governors of India. He was more at home with Indian princes than he was with the bourgeoisie in his home county, let alone laborers. And as I mentioned before, if Curzon was cold and arrogant, which he was, towards Indians, he was equally cold and arrogant towards people at home. So how much time do I have, Joanne?
About 10 minutes.
Okay. So let me, I said I'd look at a couple of the infamous incidents of empire. Let's just return to Amritsar. That's very difficult to defend, someone just shooting on unarmed people. But we should put this in context and view it against the background of growing violence that there had been in India at the time. Now, Gandhi had called a general strike 3 weeks before that, and as the day for the general strike approached, there was growing violence, people being killed, and around Amritsar, the telegraph wires were cut. And a week before the massacre, and this is sort of vaguely amusing in some ways, a lone female cyclist, a British woman, had been attacked and beaten insensitive by a mob. And at that point, the local civilian authorities turned the government over to the military authorities. In mid-Victorian society, there was nothing but so inflamed passions as a woman being attacked, particularly if she was attacked by foreigners. And so Brigadier Dyer was sent to Amritsar with the mandate to restore order, because it was mayhem and chaos and violence. He issued a proclamation when he arrived, banning all gatherings and saying that all gatherings would be fired upon. The next day, he repeated the proclamation on posters put around town, banning all gatherings and saying all gatherings would be fired upon. Well, on the third day, the people gathered, and I was going to say good to his word, that's not quite the right word, but true to his word, he ordered the soldiers to shoot. So I think we have to put what happened, not just look at it, from 2 o'clock in the afternoon to 2:30 in the afternoon. We have to put it in a context. It's important to say that his actions, Brigadier Dyer's actions, were not immediately condemned in India. In fact, the local Sikh leaders were sick and tired of the violence and the chaos, and they made Dyer an honorary Sikh in a ceremony in the Golden Temple. It was in Britain that the reaction was different. In Britain, Dyer was invalided out of the army. The Secretary of State for India condemned his actions, and in fact Edward Montagu was abused as a disloyal Jew for condemning Dyer. And Churchill, again, no more vocal advocate of empire than Churchill, he condemned the incident as monstrous, and both Montagu and Churchill made the point that the whole point of empire was to bring, and again this sounds a little condescending, the whole point of empire was to bring English, British virtues to other countries, not to act as barbarians in other countries. And a century and a half before this, Edmund Burke had made the very same point, also with regard to India, when he prosecuted and persecuted Warren Hastings, was a former governor of Bengal. And the same point was made 50 years after this, in the early 1950s, by Enoch Powell, in a famous speech in the House of Commons, denouncing the treatment of Mau Mau prisoners, detainees in Kenya. Powell said, you cannot have British standards in Britain and Kenyan standards in Kenya within the same British Empire. We are meant to be bringing our standards to the world. So anyway, just finishing with Amritsar, if I may, for what it's worth, all of the shots were fired by Indians. There wasn't a single British soldier in that troop that fired the shots. And I think what makes Amritsar so powerful today is that it was an unusual incident. If the British Empire has simply been a series of massacres, we wouldn't be remembering this one over any others. The fact that it was so unusual, I think is what that is evidence. The fact that we remember it is evidence of how unusual it was. Now, I'm going to skip over slavery, unfortunately, and just come to the sort of conclusion here, the balance sheet, if you like. But before I do that, I'd like to talk about Hong Kong. I said I would. You know, the Union flag was lowered in Hong Kong Harbor in 1997. And I recently saw a movie, I don't know if anyone's seen it, called The Hong Konger. It's fabulous, very, very powerful movie about Jimmy Lai. Jimmy Lai is the publisher of the Apple newspaper, the opposition newspaper. And this is a man in his 70s, he's accumulated a fortune. He could easily have, when the Chinese took over Hong Kong, he could easily have just moved anywhere he wanted and lived a comfortable life. But instead, he decided to stay in Hong Kong and support the freedom movement, always incidentally urging non-violence. And he was very distressed at the incidences of violence that there were. But there's a fabulous scene in this movie where, you know, you've got hundreds of thousands of Hong Kongers protesting Jimmy Lai's arrest. And they're carrying the umbrellas, they're wearing the yellow t-shirts, and literally scores of them are waving Union flags, are waving the British flag. Now that's very, very unusual for a couple of reasons, but it's very astonishing because during British rule, there never really was, or really British administration if you like, there never was an emotional connection between Britain and the Hong Kongers. I think that's true. A lot of people appreciated the Hong Kong, the British rule, but it wasn't an emotional feeling such as you got in some other colonies. And in 1997, the same year when British rule came to an end, there were two polls in Hong Kong. In the first, 3/4 said that Hong Kong would have been worse off if, without the British, and only 5% said it would have been better off without the British. And another poll had 3%, just 3%, saying that British rule had been more bad than good. Now, Hong Kong has been a haven for Chinese ever since it became a colony in 1841, as a result of the admittedly shameful Opium Wars, but that's a different issue. We'll leave that aside for now. So in 1841, Hong Kong became a British colony, and in the first 12 years after Britain took over Hong Kong, 70,000 people from the mainland fled to Hong Kong. And they did this for many, many reasons, but clearly they did it because they preferred Hong Kong under the British to China under the Manchu at that point, not even under the Chinese. A century later, 1961 census, more than half of the residents in Hong Kong had been born in China and had fled there when the communists took over. So one of the most famous Chinese people who moved to Hong Kong, this is not well known, was Sun Yat-sen, 1883. He lived in Hong Kong for a period. He was no fan of imperialism at all. But he was so impressed with the British rule in Hong Kong, particularly the security, and even more so, the lack of corruption, and he talked about this, the lack of corruption, that this is his experience in Hong Kong that led him to want to form a Chinese government based on Western principles. And I quote, "We must carry this British example of good government to every part of China." And not coincidentally, now that China has assumed control of Hong Kong, the movement from the mainland has largely ended. So let's just look in conclusion at the balance sheet. Britain bought many things to its colonies: potable water, plumbing, sewers, hospitals, schools, colleges, irrigation, modern roads, railways, electricity. It bought many less tangible things: common law, limited government, a concept of liberty, a system of land tenure, it's very important for economic development, the rule of law, an independent judiciary, a free press, incorrupt government, a non-partisan civil service, It also brought team sports. I think among the many things that we bequeathed to India, cricket might be the greatest gift. Now, many of those practical things, plumbing, sewers, and hospitals, they would have come eventually, no doubt. But the rest of it, I question, and counterfactuals are impossible to prove, but I question whether a lot of the concepts of rule of law and liberty would have necessarily come to the rest of the world. South African General Jan Smuts, he's an Afrikaans, not an Englishman, by the way, an Afrikaans, and remember we had a war with the Afrikaans. He said the British Empire is the widest system of organized freedom which has ever existed in human history. So you think of Jamaica and Nigeria and Botswana and Malaysia, they all have some approximation of liberal democracy and the rule of law to some degree. I think that is the biggest legacy of the British Empire and unquestionably a good thing.
Mr. Day, I was talking with
Mr.
my dad.
Day?
Yeah, Mr. Adrian. So I was talking with my dad last week. I was in India, and he was mentioning to me how completely incorruptible the British bureaucrats were when they were ruling the country. And this was happening because for the last 6 to 8 months, along with my dad, I have been meeting some of the very top bureaucrats in the country, in the central province of Madhya Pradesh. And you walk into these the offices of these bureaucrats, and the first question you get asked is, what are your connections? And basically there are two things that it's not about issues, it's all about who you are connected with and how much bribe you can pay. Invariably, it's about bribe. Every single person wants a briefcase filled with cash. So that's and when my granddad died, he still had photographs of British royalty in his office, and the reason was that he had realized that the kind of junkies that India had got after the British had departed. Now talking about General Dyer, there's an interesting act in India called Armed Forces Special Power Act 1958, which allows Indian armed forces to kill and rape with impunity. The normal courts cannot get involved when the police or the military kills Indian civilians. The total number of Indian civilians killed by Indian armed forces, and I'm talking about the army and the military, is more than the number of Chinese or Pakistanis Indian army killed. So that's how Indian army is used. Right. The current Prime Minister of India was the Chief Minister of Gujarat 20 years back, when over a few weeks about 2,000 people were killed in a program. Among them was a bunch of people who had killed a rare person who ended up in the prison, but some of these people were released last week. They were responsible for killing babies, men and women, and raping a couple of women. When they came out, they were given a hero's welcome by the government, and you can look for it on internet. Sweets were distributed, and why did that happen? Because elections are coming in Gujarat in a couple of months, and you can understand what the local culture is, that they will vote for the government, the ruling party, because they let go released rapists. Now at least the British government tried to correct what it might have done wrong with having General Dyer, but as you correctly explained, that there's a lot of nuances to that story than the world knows about. But I'll
just while you're going, yes, your story about photographs. I remember the first former British colony I travelled to was the Bahamas, and I went into the homes of local people, but black people, poor people. I don't mean the government offices, the poor people, and I bet you more than half of them would have a picture of the Queen and Prince Philip in pride of place in the living room.
Thank you, sir. You glossed over slavery in the British Empire.
Yeah.
And one thing I'd like to bring to people's attention is that from 1808 to 1860, the Royal Navy captured 1,600 slave ships and freed 150,000 African slaves at a cost of 1,500 men of the Royal Navy. There was no profit in this action, no gain of empire. It seemed to be a moral imperative, perhaps excusing what they felt as British guilt. But today, we have empires again, and perhaps with the live and let live question, empires in China, totalitarian force. How do we take the lesson of empire today to be able to fight against that? The American Civil War and Lincoln may have freed the slaves and calibrated the law, but they did not actually free the slaves. The British Empire did. And I would recommend this War of the West book by Douglas Murray as documentation further on this.
Yeah, no, that's very good. Yeah, I didn't really talk about slavery, but there's a couple of points about slavery. The most important thing to remember about, slavery in the British Empire is it was never an official policy, if you like, or an official government enterprise. I think we know that when the ships from Europe, including British ships, private ships, went to the African coast, they were sold slaves that had in fact been captured by Africans themselves. It wasn't a matter of the British Army went in and just grabbed people, as in fact they did in England to press gang people into the Navy. That's a different story. But, it was private, and in fact, from the very beginning, there was opposition as you say, on a purely moral basis. There was opposition to slavery in England. We could talk about that a long time, but I do think, as you say, that when Britain abolished the slave trade in 1807, that was an act signed by King George III. He wasn't all bad, by the way. Shortly after that, they started patrolling. The Royal Navy, of course, controlled the seas at that time, and they would prohibit any slave trading. And that, as you say, was purely, if you like, altruistic, or purely because people thought slavery was wrong. There was no benefit in that. In fact, we nearly went to war with Brazil, of all countries, over stopping slave trade. Sorry.
There are a lot of questions, so why not we concurrently with Q&A? If those people who want to pick up coffee, they can go out and pick up coffee, but we can keep running the questions for you, Adrian. Okay,
and I'll be quicker with my answers.
Hi, my name is Peter. As a former subject of the British Commonwealth, and whose father, refugee from China, swimming to Hong Kong, and also a formerly newspaper columnist at Jimmy's paper.
Oh, you were?
Yes.
Oh.
So I have to give credit to the British Empire, and otherwise there wouldn't Hong Kong would have never been existed, because the emperor in China, when he gave Hong Kong to Britain, to Queen Victoria, I mean, he didn't even know where Hong Kong is. But my question is, so my understanding of your talk is the British Empire bringing civilization to many parts of the world. But on the same, and the Americans, like the neo-conservatives, they also think that they brings democracy to many parts of the world. So if you think the British colonialism is a success, where the American one not so much of a success, why? Or put it this way, is it wrong even for the British to export the civilization to the world?
Yeah, those are very good questions and very difficult questions. When you say, let's answer the second one first. When you say, is it wrong for Britain to, export? Let's assume they're good values, the rule of law and freedom. Is it wrong to export those values? I'm not pretending that theoretically this is the way the world should be run, or this is necessarily a good idea to have countries invading and taking over other countries, even if you're exporting good things. So I'm not suggesting that. I'm just suggesting perhaps that the common view of the British Empire is grossly exaggerated in terms of motives and in terms of results, and that as a practical thing, and I certainly don't believe the end justifies the means, but as a practical thing, the British Empire did more good than bad. There's no question there was bad. There's no question about that. I mentioned Hong Kong. We got it through the Opium Wars. They were not exactly, the most glorious phase of British history, trying to push opium on people. As you rightly said, Hong Kong at that time was, well, I'm using my words now, not yours, but Hong Kong was basically a barren rock at that time. It was nothing. Incidentally, Hong Kong, as you know, was given in perpetuity to the British. Kowloon was given on a 99-year lease. So Hong Kong Island didn't have the 99-year lease, and when time was approaching, 1997, Margaret Thatcher actually asked the Department of Defense if they could draw up a plan to militarily defend Hong Kong. So she wanted to keep Hong Kong and give Kowloon back, but the Department of Defense said it was basically impossible to defend against the Chinese army. And that's when she went into the negotiations and picked up on Deng's concept of one country, two systems. Two systems, thank you, which was Deng, but she picked up on it, and that's what she tried to push through. I know a lot of people. I saw it in that movie, The Hong Konger. Have you seen that movie?
Actually, no.
Oh, you should. I was crying. It is very, very, very emotional. What happened to this man, who seems like a good man to me, as far as I can tell. I mean, according to the movie. But sorry, where was I going with that?
So the American versus...
Yeah, well, that's more difficult. Again, if you start with the premise that it is not morally right for a country to, take over and impose their rule on other countries, then you look at the consequences. And I think if you look at the consequences of the American empire, you would probably argue that they have not been, they've not been for the good. So it comes down to a practical issue rather than a moral issue.
I wanted to congratulate you, Adrian, on a magnificent talk. I really learned a lot from it, and I thank you for it. The comment I had is that if you gave this speech as a professor at a university, even with tenure, you would have been fired.
Even if I take out the nasty words?
Even if you take out the words that you're not allowed to say. Just saying colonialism is good in any way, manner, shape, or form. You would probably be fired even with tenure. You'd have to go to court to try to get your job back, and you might or might not succeed. So bad is academia.
Yeah. Well, there's a chap, now I can't think of his name. He's just written a book called, Bruce someone is his name. Does anyone know him? He's just written a book called The Last Imperialist, which was a really interesting book about a guy born in British Guiana, actually, who an English heritage, born in British Guiana and or Scots heritage, I should say, to be more accurate, because Scots don't like being called English. But anyway, this chap is a professor of history at some minor Northwestern university. But there was a petition, exactly. He wrote this book on the last imperialist, which had some good things to say about imperialism, and he was there was a petition online to get him fired. And there's a wonderful comment from some guy, I forget his name, sorry, but he lived in Uttar Pradesh, and he wrote back, "I will never sign your petition. Now piss off." I thought that was wonderful. But anyway, sorry.
Hello. I didn't want to really ask a question. I just wanted to say that I was there in 1974 in India. Just, there wasn't a lot of tourism, there was no build-up yet. And I was there with my mother, and the only buildings that were standing were bank buildings. The railway had been built by the British, the railway buildings and a few government buildings, and one or two hotels. Otherwise, there was no infrastructure. And that was all built by the British, and we noted that. The other thing was about slavery. They were they had the untouchables in India, and they would let them do the dirty work and step on them as they went out the door. It was they had a very inbuilt sort of kind of slavery way. And the last point was Hong Kong. We were there in the early 70s. And I remember we were shopping in a mall. It was very modern, there was traffic, everything. And a guy was selling tickets to go by boat over to mainland China. So my mother and I took it. We went over by boat to mainland China. There were no roads, no buildings, no cars. Everyone wore a little mouse shirt. And we even saw people carrying those sticks, sticks on their back to carry the weight of things. So we noticed a big difference in progress and infrastructure in those countries where the British had been.
Yeah. Interesting.
Quickly, given some of the disastrous events that happened during the end of British imperial rule, for example, when they pulled out the almost immediate conflict between India and Pakistan, what practical steps could have been taken to preserve the colonial rule throughout the 20th century?
To preserve it throughout the 20th century?
Right.
Wow. Yeah. It's I think the India-Pakistan situation was really a matter of damned if you do and damned if you don't, because there was so much pressure at that time, as you know, there was so much pressure for independence, including incidentally from America, who was pushing Britain to get rid of their colonies as fast as they could. It was, I think that was a no-win situation, frankly. If Britain had tried to hold on to India for a longer period of time, in order for a more orderly, and of course nobody knew it was going to be quite as bad as it was, but if Britain had tried to hold on to it for a more orderly independence movement, I think it just would have caused the chaos to arise anyway. So that was an almost impossible situation at that point, I think. I don't know if Giant agrees with that. But your question, Enoch Powell, who I mentioned earlier, incidentally, he went to, when the Conservatives were returned in 1950, I don't know if you know this, he was a brigadier general himself in the British Army, youngest brigadier general in the English Army, incidentally, in the British Army. And he went to Churchill with a plan how 3 divisions could retake India. To which Churchill said, after it left, he said, "Who was that madman?"
I know I only got time for a real quick question here, but as I was listening to your talk, I was thinking about my good friend Alessandro Fusillo, who is a libertarian lawyer in Italy, and a very proud person who's from Rome, actually. He would have said, yes, of course, what you're talking about, but you know, it all started with the Roman Empire.
Right.
And then, of course, people who were Greek in the room would say, well, no, this thing started back in Greece. And I would say, as an American, sure, there were good things about the British Empire, but we really hit our peak during the American Revolution. And I guess the point I'm seeing, and that I want to know if you agree with, is we human apes have been evolving, not just physically, but also socially, right? We can kind of track the centers of power in the world, right? Whoever does a better job getting closer to the philosophy we are promoting is going to be the world's superpower. So I want to know if you agree with this evolution, and if you agree that what we're trying to do in this room is to get to the next level in terms of exporting a certain principle, a certain set of values that we know is going to get us away from hitting each other over the head to getting to a place where we can trade and find win-win agreements and increase standards of living.
Yeah, well, a couple of points. Firstly, just on the Roman Empire. I mean, the fundamental difference between the British Empire and the Roman Empire, in my view, is that the Roman Empire brought incredible material benefits to the people they conquered. You know, in Britain was a Roman colony, of course. We haven't started asking for recompense for being slaves, but you can look at Britain today. We still use some of the roads that the Romans built. We still use some of the aqueducts that the Romans built. This is incredible.
The Commonwealth itself is based on Rome.
Yeah, when you think about it, it's incredible. So the practical benefits from the Roman Empire are no gainsaying those. But what Britain brought that Rome didn't was that sense of the rule of law and the concept of liberty, as General Smuts said. Sorry, what was the? Yeah, I'm not really necessarily a Whig that thinks the world's always getting better. I mean, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But you mentioned trade, dealing with people on trade and commerce, and I think Giant will appreciate this from his knowledge of Indian history, but trade was really the driving force of the British Empire. I didn't get into that, but there was a belief that people had the right to trade freely. So that was just taken as a given. We have the right to trade freely. And if people in other countries don't let us trade freely, they've got to be forced to trade freely, because that is a human right. And that was and you saw that in India very much. You saw it in China as well. But that was very much a basis of the British Empire, was opening up trade. Okay.
Adrian, thank you very much.
Thank you.